Right,
So
I think I'm
you
now sharing my screen
yeah.
and doing a slideshow, which I think.
Yeah.
So if everyone can see that, then I'm going to talk about Is It Any Good? Which is looking at how you might evaluate the quality of art. And sort of by way of background, I'm going to play in some of the things I happen to have had in the past. I'm kind of making the best of the fact that my degree was in philosophy. I've had a career as an accountant, but I've also been interested in creative writing, and that's led me into art criticism and curating, which is more what I do now because I've retired from my day job. And I'm actually applying some accounting techniques to art, which is a bit unusual, I suppose. And as you can see from that first screen, you can find quite a lot of my stuff if you want to online. I've got my own blog spot with reviews and articles. I'm pretty active on Instagram, put up one thing a day normally of things that I find interesting. Free is a good place to read reviews. I've got a weekly column at Fad magazine. And I curate quite a lot of shows. The next one is actually an online-only show for Ron Mandos Gallery, which is based in Amsterdam, which will be of artist animations, which I think will be an interesting show. And that opens in August. So that's sort of introductory. And then I need to page down, don't I? Not working. Why isn't page down working? All right.
Show mouse on that. Yeah.
So what I've done is to carry out a sort of assessment of how you might look at whether you can quantify in some ways and compare how good art is as a way of discriminating between artworks. And I then emailed out to essentially my sort of the list I've got of people who are interested in art I'm in contact with, and asked if anyone would like to undertake a survey, and had 7 illustrative works which people then ranked according to a system I gave them. The idea was to look at, given that it's a very subjective matter to assess the quality of art, what happened if you tried to structure that subjectivity and see what that told you. That means there's going to be a framework that's applied to it for something that's normally intuitive. But I think in practice what will happen is you kind of go back and forth between the framework and your intuitions. And I had about 100 replies to the survey, so I emailed out to about 500, so pretty reasonable response rate. And then what I'll do is talk about a report which is available to be sent out to people that I've done as a result of the kind of the approach I set out and the survey we undertook. I thought the idea was talk for half an hour or so, and then have a discussion for half an hour at the end, because it'll be an interesting part of this process. I'm developing the approach. If people have got things to say, opinions, questions to ask, it'd be useful to have those feeding into it. So the framework that I came up with, and there's been a kind of iteration that I have one set of questions and then people make comments on the questions as well as giving answers to the framework. So I've got here the one that builds in some of the comments that people were made to me. So the idea is to assess your personal response to works of art, and that wasn't what you think people generally think, but what you think personally. And then came up with some potential criteria for what might make a work good. Originality was the first category, and that got quite a lot of emphasis. So altogether, 130 points, and 3 of the categories, so 30 points were on originality. And distinguished there between the level of the oeuvre, which is, if you like, is the whole practice of the artist, interestingly original, and then originality at the level of the particular work, because you do get this where some artists repeat something rather similar, and you might then think, well, can you give the same originality marks to say, the 100th Rothko of roughly that composition you've seen, or do you give more credit to, say, someone like Picasso who's changing things all the time? Obviously, it's possible to take a view that with Rothko there are subtle differences, and that is in another form of originality. But there's an opportunity there to distinguish those. And then using a distinctive art language, not necessarily an orthodox language, or maybe you use a language to undermine it, but you need some kind of, I think a distinctive language is a critical thing. Second area was related to content. So it was having something worthwhile to say, which could be all sorts of things. Originally, I think that was interpreted as being largely a political matter, but actually can equally be on human feelings or other areas, or even about art itself. Relevantly connected to time and place of creation. So the themes might be universal, but some connection to how it's produced that meaningfully links to the circumstances. Being open to the generation of meanings rather than a closed statement. I think that's probably true of all great works, that they seem to have this ability to take on fresh interpretations over time. And an engagement with an awareness of the tradition. Typically that would be to refresh or change and challenge, perhaps, not just to be aware of it and copy something that's gone before. And then the third category is the means of expression. So that's where you've got aesthetic coherence, whether the form somehow reinforces the content, the tone, whether you can generate emotions, feelings, humour and so on in an appropriate way, whether you communicate successfully with your audience, and whether there's an appropriately skilled and technically competent execution. It doesn't necessarily mean traditional skills. So one of the examples I asked people to look at was Tracey Emin's Bed. That obviously is not very traditional, but you might argue there's still questions that can be asked about the skills around that. And then at the end of that, they seemed the obvious kind of tick box type criteria, but I thought a really good work has something extra beyond that, which I called an X factor, which sort of transcends the criteria. People seem to like that idea, and I originally gave it 10 points. I doubled it because I did ask people, are some of these things more important than others? And the only area where I got several replies saying they thought it was more important was this business of an X factor, some sort of transcendental, hard to pin down, which I'll come back to. So what we're seeking is, does the work demonstrate the kind of qualities above? Not necessarily simply to apply them, but maybe to subvert them. So I then asked people to rank on this basis, and of the 100 replies I got, I think 76 gave me rankings and maybe some comments as well, and quite a few objected to the process and wouldn't give me a ranking. I think that was interesting in itself, so those comments were also useful. And there were three main reasons people objected on principle to the system. One was that the wrong type of questions were being asked, that I was enshrining a preconceived view of what makes good art. So, for example, one quote from a respondent was, "It's problematic that your survey is only sent to those with art intelligence, because I don't think the opinions of these people should be prioritised. They place undue emphasis on intellectual content, in my opinion. I find this an elitist construct and a biased set of criteria." So if I'm looking just at trying to structure something which is normally subjective, then in a way this isn't a big problem, because I can say that what I'm doing is structuring the subjectivity of people who are interested in art. Most of the respondents were artists or involved in some pretty strong way in the art world. But there is a kind of underlying question there as well, which you might say it's what kind of thing is art. I was thinking if you're looking at medicine, then you obviously give a big value to expert knowledge, and you're not likely to say, well, anyone can tell me what to do with my illness. Whereas I think comedy has got an interesting counterexample in that people tend to rank comedy by whether it makes them laugh, and they don't, I think, prioritise in the same way that an expert might have a more valid opinion on comedy than just the general person. And I suspect art has elements of both those. But I think that's an interesting question I could look at further, but it's probably beyond the scope at the moment. So the second objection in principle was that there was too much variation in the background and knowledge of the respondents. It was too diverse for the answers to make sense. I think it's true that there were kind of issues around that. I didn't particularly see them as undermining the principles, but some people objected that they had too little knowledge. So could they really give a verdict on an artist who they hadn't heard of before, only had an image of it, not the actual work, had to research in order to find out about them? Others objected because they had too much knowledge. So could they really set aside the narratives they'd already understood about that work from the general cultural background? So, for example, one person said, "Some of the works are impossible for me to evaluate because the narratives that surround them prevent me from looking at them objectively." So that could be a difficulty. But I think it's a practical difficulty rather than one of principle. And then the third complaint, if you like, was that the whole business of quantification is out of place when you're looking at art. That, for example, scoring artworks made me feel as if I'm watching sport. But it's interesting that we do already have other areas where we kind of give measures to art. The most obvious one is value in financial terms. But also you might look at museum attendance levels. You might look at number of likes on Instagram, various ways where you can see numbers which are associated with art. So scoring is not necessarily completely different from that. Someone else made a comparison that with another very subjective area, we don't always fall in love with a high-scored perfect person. So what does trigger them to love them? And there may be something you can't necessarily explain. That comes back perhaps to that X factor. And I think there is an element for that. But I wasn't convinced that we necessarily couldn't quantify. And there's also the option you can look at the criteria without quantifying them as well. And quite a few respondents did say that they started sceptically, but when they filled in the scores, they found it more persuasive than they expected. So someone said, for example, "Finally, I stopped thinking about scoring and just started doing it. And aware of the difficulties, I was surprised by the scores. Your system made me more serious and less cynical than I usually would be, and it worked perfectly." So that was interesting. And so I mentioned that X factor as being an important thing. And here are some quotes about what it was that kind of goes beyond the obvious criteria that people thought they wanted to take into account. So I think different people could have a different X factor, but you're still putting it into the system. So nags at you afterwards or gives you a glitchy feeling in the stomach, has a kind of energy, élan vital, makes me think differently about the world, has an element of surprise, inspires me in my own practice, or conveys engagement with humanity. They all seem to me perfectly sensible things you might look for, which you wouldn't expect every artwork to have, but you'd expect perhaps a good artwork to have something of this sort that's at that extra factor. So just to flick through the 7 works I asked about, I tried to get a mix of mostly well-known things, so people didn't have to do lots of research and they might have seen the work before, but to mix it up a bit. So Picasso, I expected actually that would get very high marks, and it did get the highest ranking of the 7, but actually it was not as much you might expect. I mean, one respondent said Picasso occupies a completely different stratosphere to the other 6 works and thought it was completely incomprehensible anyone could not have it top. But in fact, only 71% placed Picasso top of these 7. And some respondents place it as low as 3rd or 4th. Interesting, I thought. Then Helen Frankenthaler, Mountains and Sea, which is one of the first stained abstract works, so it had a kind of art historical position. And then I'll just go down. Dat Vetriano, which I thought was interesting because it's very famous, but perhaps not something which is typically highly rated in the art world, as opposed to going back to that question, the general public. Tracy Emin, I mentioned, My Bed, obviously in some ways seminal, but controversial, and I think that applies both to the art and the less involved audience. Francis Elise, Paradox of Praxis, which is a film work, which is pushing ice around Mexico City. That was very highly rated in general. A Damien Hirst, but not perhaps one of his most iconic ones, but more one that might be seen as production line type work, so those kind of issues could be assessed. And the work which I thought was interesting, but people might not know as well, so I had one in there that they'd have to research a bit, which is Sengonegundi. And the scores, so what we did, put all those marks in and got a percentage score for each of those 7 works. In a way, it's how it applies rather than the particular scores that's the main point. But it did come out that, as I say, Picasso came top pretty clearly, Elise came second. Frankenthaler, Emin and Nengoudi had pretty much equal position in the kind of joint 3rd to 5th. And Hirst and Vetriano were at the bottom on that. I think that didn't particularly surprise me as a total outcome. So I think what would be interesting is to have a discussion that's more around not so much, I'm happy to talk about those particular works, but not so much whether the scores are right for those works as how sensible is it to have a framework that fills in scores against works of art. Now, is the idea of a framework worthwhile? So that's the criteria I've set out against which you would assess whether a work is good. Are the criteria in the framework the right criteria? And then, is it sensible to apply scores to that framework? You could have the framework without applying any scores. One advantage of applying scores is it does make you think about each of the different elements in quite a precise way. And again, that's what if you look at, I mentioned accountancy, it's kind of an accountancy approach. Obviously, accountancy is largely about quantifying things, but quite often there's subjective things. So you might have to make a judgment about, for example, how much debt in future you'll be able to collect or not. There's a lot of subjective judgment in that, but you then turn it into a number, and that does concentrate the mind somewhat. And it does also mean that comparisons are possible. So if you're looking at comparisons between companies, obviously that's helped by the numbers. But if you're looking at comparisons between artworks, there are quite a lot of circumstances where you are making those kind of judgments, like you're deciding who gets in a show, who doesn't, who gets representation, who doesn't, who gets the Turner Prize, who doesn't. It doesn't seem to me necessarily stupid that you would, as part of the process, I don't think you'd say it's definitive, but you might say as part of the process, why don't we score the Turner Prize contenders against this framework, and then we'll have other discussions as well. But one bit might be to do that as a kind of a groundwork which structures the subjectivities involved in a way which I'm not saying makes it objective. You've still got subjective judgments in there, but it does structure it in a way which has a certain logic, makes sure the different factors are considered in a reasonably consistent way. And then the other question might be interesting to think about is this question of how informed the audience needs to be or should be. So you could apply the framework I've just mentioned. It would be interesting to do so. It might be one of the things I'll do in future to a broader cross-section of people. Or you could say the idea of a framework's okay, but do we need to adjust the framework to account for more broad interests? The kind of suspicion I think that the people who objected to the exercise on those sort of grounds was that they would put more account on technical ability and the content and less on perhaps the more conceptual aspects. So is it inappropriately elitist, or is it actually that the people who know about art most are the best placed people to make these judgments. So I think they're interesting questions to discuss. I've got a kind of the report that sets all this out in more detail is 19 pages long. I'm happy to send that out to anyone who wants to see it. But I thought what might be useful now is to have a discussion around, perhaps focused around these 4 questions as to how we might take this forward, whether it's useful, whether it tells us anything, and I'll then be building this into either an more academically presented article or some other way of taking forward the questions, and what people say now will helpfully feed into that process. I thought that's what I'd do, just to run through and then lead into a discussion, which I think would be the more interesting bit.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Paul. I'm going to unmute everyone, and if you're okay to stop sharing your screen, and I'll put everyone in gallery view.
Yep.
So we can
Okay.
see. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? But yeah, you're still. You need to unmute yourself first. You should be able to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Cheers, Paul. Yeah, it'd be great to see that kind of the further research if you want to pop it over. But I guess like my kind of main question was about, I guess you kind of mentioned like that you received some pushback in terms of trying to create like a tangible like framework of evaluation or striving for some kind of like objectivism within like an evaluation of art. And do you think that's something that's very specific to the art world or the fine art world? And then I guess you can kind of go a step further with it in terms of maybe looking at something like evolutionary psychology, which kind of attempts to break down, you know, even things as complex as art making as a behavior. And therefore we can kind of break down the the kind of evaluation or the worth of that art in a way. You know, so it would kind of attempt to break it down in terms of almost like an animal display. So, you know, if everything kind of goes towards that kind of behavior of display or kind of showing or exhibiting, then you kind of break it down from there. That kind of makes sense. So yeah, I was just kind of wondering why you think it's so specific to art and the art world, this kind of pushback against objectivism.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's completely just specific to the art world. I think whatever judgments you made about other art forms, as it were, could be similarly questioned. And also, you could compare it with, in philosophy, you've got aesthetics, where the question of what to do, what's right and wrong, is kind of interesting in a sort of parallel way. And there is a question which is often asked in aesthetics, which is there an objective truth here? So is there an absolute, as it were, that what's right and what's wrong, or is it just the result of what people think? If you like, think through to your kind of behavioural psychology aspects, is it just the build-up of all those things and of what people have done in practice in the past, and there isn't actually an objective truth to it? And that's a very kind of deep and parallel debate in some ways to the art question. And there's 2 kind of big questions which I did kind of leave to one side at the beginning. One was that one, like, is this actually an area of objective truth? And I think that's the one that's very similar to philosophical questions. And the other one was I've forgotten now. What was the other question? I've forgotten. Sorry, I lost my thread there.
Was it to do with aesthetics?
Well, I think that parallel to aesthetics. I wouldn't say
you had objective truth, type of truth, yeah. And then the other one was it to do with the aesthetic response? I can't remember. Maybe I'm throwing a spanner in the works, so I'll shut up.
Okay.
So this was the question from your slide or from me? or both?
Oh no, it's just something I mentioned, but I've forgotten what I mentioned now. Sorry, I'll come back to it.
Maybe can I give you a chance to have a think about that and just make an observation? Just go back to something that you mentioned early on. One of the respondents mentioned about. I'm paraphrasing here, but the idea that the way that you constructed the framework and the way that you had presented things and the language that you'd used suggested a form of sort of elitism that they felt uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
And there needed to be a more sort of an inclusive framework. Now, as I was listening to that, I could understand where that respondent was coming from, but I went off down a little wormhole and started thinking, okay, so you've got this person who hasn't got the lexicon, they haven't got all the terms, they're not articulate, they can't express their responses to the artwork at day one. But then what happens if their responses lead them to return to the work again and again? Surely they're going to acquire the very attributes that person is saying is elitist. Or is it possible, here's a question, is it possible for that person to retain some way of engaging with art, going deeper and deeper, but not becoming the elitist sort of thing that respondent had an issue with?
Yeah,
I haven't got the answer to that. It's just something I've started to think about.
I think, in a way, that's a dilemma. Is it that, for want of a better word, that the general public could be educated in art and come to the same conclusions, or is it that there's actually an alternative way of assessing these things, which might have its own merits, which we could identify as being held more broadly than the comparatively narrow bit that we've looked at? So yeah, I think that's the question, because what you're suggesting is that the two might collapse into each other, that if you gave long enough to anyone who was engaged with the question, they would eventually arrive at a similar position, and that might be true, it might not be true. That would be interesting to look at.
Yeah, I think yeah. I'm saying that. I think one of my concerns is that I tend to hear the word elitist, and I know it can exist. I know there are people who do kind of employ a certain sort of power dynamic with the art language of knowing, and in general conversation maybe show off that they can talk about art in a particular way. But I think that's the exception. I think the majority of people who are serious practitioners engage, they build up a lexicon, they build up a way of talking about art that I feel quite defensive about if the general public perceive that as being elitist. It's just that somebody's gone deep into a subject, whether it happens to be visual art or whether it's music. You need a particular way of talking about things that can come across as obscure and obtuse, you know. I suppose it's a small point maybe, but yeah,
music is similar, isn't it? There's theory of music, but you can listen to music without a theory or with it.
Without the circle of fifth and etc. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure how exact that comparison is.
Uli had a question, then we'll go to Marguerite. But I think Uli put her hand up first. Do you still have a question?
Should I ask?
Yeah.
I was just curious, Paul. I found this fascinating. It's interesting. It's a really interesting thing to take part in. Thank you so much for making it. But I'm curious what actually prompted you to do it. Like how you just suddenly decided to make this survey, or like something hinted you into it, or how it's happened, the whole thing.
Well, I suppose partly it was I was thinking what kind of things would be interesting to do during lockdown. So that was kind of a motivation for setting off various projects in terms of timing. But I had the thought for a long time that I've got an unusual background for someone I've always been interested in art, but I've got an unusual background in being an accountant. So were there things I could import from one area to the other? And I thought that quantification was the obvious thing you don't get in art, but you do get in accountancy. So was there a way in which it would be interesting to quantify art responses? And I write a lot of reviews and tend to be, I suppose, assessing art in that sense. But I actually like, thinking back on it, it's not. I haven't been quantifying it myself doing that, so I thought it was interesting to look at whether there were possibilities. And one of the questions for me in future, I suppose, is should I be quantifying things when I review them, and not necessarily to use in the review, but as part of the process. That'd be quite interesting too.
That's
I mean, do
interesting.
you have a problem?
But are you going
Oh,
to
sorry.
continue to like ask people to evaluate more works? Are you going to like continue with this questionnaire? So how are you looking at it?
Yes, I think I may see if there's a way of broadening it out in some way in the ways we've discussed. I think it's a bit tricky because artists have got an interest in art, and like I know lots of artists you could ask who are likely to respond. Whereas I think if I try and tap the general public, that might be more difficult. But certainly something worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Actually, I thought of the question I meant to mention before, which was apart from is it objective truth, the other question which you get a lot of discussion of in philosophy of art is it art or not? How do you define what art is? And that's something I thought you could set to one side as well, on the grounds that people could answer your framework. And if it wasn't art, it didn't matter too much. Presumably, it wouldn't score very highly. But you didn't need to decide that in advance, because that's in itself a very complicated question.
Agreed.
I think a bit like philosophy, art, what defines art is peer group review. And you can find people who are working quite isolated. And of course, if you've been through art college, we've all been through the same system, maybe not all at the same time. And I have noticed, for instance, things that I understood when I went through art college, and my daughter's been through art college. She's grappling with the ideas, why is this person so important? And I had this conversation that this person, like Guston, when he came out with the work that she likes, was completely rejected by his peer group. But he had a history of being very accepted by his peer group. But now what's coming back is it's like there's no kind of line of history. Everything is available all at the same time, as if it's all done right now. And so they don't have a sense of, a continuum of history. Like when I was talking about art history, there was this period that led to this period, that this to this period. Whereas now everything is possible. And then again with Duchamp, he completely threw out an awful lot of the art philosophy that I was taught as a criteria, like the Tolstoy's What is Art, or Coleridge, his book on what is art, which kind of helped one to sort of construct your thinking when you're an art student as a criteria, actually. So there's an idea, and I think a lot of artists I've spoken to, they know when they're doing something authentic. They know when they're doing something that's not quite authentic. And what I find surprising, other artists see it straight away. And so with musicians, they know when someone's doing a bad music. But it's very hard to quantify why is one album not good to another album by the same artist. That's just this kind of quality. As soon as you see something that's got that quality, you're speechless. And the person who did it is probably speechless. It's a mysterious process. And that's what makes it interesting to do.
Is that the X Factor bit I'm talking about? It's a good bit for the X Factor thing I was talking about, is authenticity, possibly.
What's interesting about you, Paul, is that you are an accountant. And you think in a completely different way from artists. And your writing is incredibly cool. It's not emotive. It's not, like a lot of artists write about other artists. There's nothing disingenuous about your writing. You are as objective, I think, as anyone could be, because you haven't been brainwashed by anything.
But true, I haven't got any art training. Yeah.
Yeah, but with training also comes opinion. A lot of art teaching I've had was when I was much younger, in my 20s, was very opinionated. They had this idea of breaking you down and building you up in there. And at 18, when someone comes in with a piece of work and they say, "What the fuck's that?" I mean, and I've been to a convent, I would just burst into tears. I just think, I would appreciate something a bit cooler, because you go away puzzled about, you don't know what you've done wrong. And they just were probably a bit angry that they were in a provincial town and not in London. But, that's what you seem to be nicely immune to, because you don't have, your identity it does not rely on what you write or what you do in this field. You have another identity, several other identities. And that's my...
Yeah, I'm a retired accountant now, so perhaps my identity is slipping somewhat.
But you can write poetry. So. But you got a lot of stick about this. I mean, there's one art teacher I put you onto, and he got quite angry and wasn't going to take part. And eventually I persuaded him, it could be interesting to engage with it. I think people get very defensive as well.
I think that anger is worth looking at, or trying to capture and isolate.
Yeah. I was quite pleased with, you got it stick, but I was quite pleased with getting the comments. I mean, obviously a lot of people might have decided, well, I think this is ridiculous, I'm not replying at all. But quite a lot of people did reply to explain why they didn't think it was sensible. And they were some of the most interesting comments. So I was grateful for those. And yeah, there are all things that you could push a bit further and look at. And I should say, I don't see this as it's not that this replaces anything. It's just another angle of looking at things. I'm not suggesting that people ought to be assessing in a more quantified or systematic manner necessarily. There's still plenty of room for intuitive assessments.
Well, can you talk a little bit about how much control you have over the choice of content when you're writing, like how you make the decisions of what to write about?
It varies depending on what the medium is you're working for. So obviously for Instagram, I can just choose what I like each day. I've got a weekly column which I'm in control of, so basically it's my content. Then if you want to write for magazines, and I write for, say, Frieze and Art Monthly, then the system is you have to pitch what you want to write about, and usually they say no. So you have to pitch quite a lot of things to get something accepted. Obviously, you get to know what things magazines like or don't like to some extent, but I haven't yet found, over sort of 10 years of writing for these places, that it's got completely predictable. So I'm still surprised by what's turned down or sometimes by what's accepted. And I think they have their own criteria, but they don't really have a framework. They don't send. I've never known a magazine send out a framework saying this is maybe sort of another framework could be applied, but nothing saying, oh, this is how we know what we might want written about, what we don't. There are some fairly broad rules, like Art Monthly. I think they've changed a bit. They used to have a rule they didn't review painting at all, so that was fairly easy to handle. But that seems to be shifting a bit in the last 2 or 3 years. So yes, it's you kind of find something you think would be interesting and then suggest it and see what comes back. And it's obviously influenced by other factors like how many other things they've got. Would you like to suggest a review for a show? And the show's already up, or it's opening next week. There's no chance at all of that. You've got to be well in advance because the magazine takes quite a long time to edit and produce it, and then they want it out reasonably close to the show, or even ideally when it's still on. Obviously online those things are much simpler. But yeah, I'd say it's quite a complicated process. That's the less attractive bit of writing about art, is the need to pitch things and keep on top of what you have pitched and what comes back and get the deadlines and those bits, the admin of it.
I do have a question. following on from that, how does it work with really kind of scathing reviews? Do they ever get accepted for publication, or is it kind of written in euphemisms? Or, yeah, how does that work?
I think it actually operates before that point. I think there's an editorial policy which tends, there was a magazine I once wrote for called Art in America, which actually had a policy of positive reviews, which is a bit odd, but they were explicit about it, and they operated a bit differently. They'd send me something saying, "Would you review this show?" And I'd either reply saying, "Oh yes, fine," or I'd reply saying, "Well, it won't be a very good review because I don't like that artist." And then they'd say, "Well, don't review that then." So that's unusual though. But I think the magazines they generally want to review things they think are worthwhile, so they're likely to skew it towards things they will think will be viewed positively. And so you do get this kind of culture that most of the reviews are positive, which I think's a bit of a pity. It's very entertaining to read negative reviews, and obviously Brian Sewell was famous for that. But it's interesting, if you look at Matthew Collings in the Evening Standard, he writes pretty positive reviews generally, and I think there must be some kind of editorial steer there, because he used to write much more negatively, I think. And yeah, I don't get that much opportunity for scathing reviews, I'd say, because I pitch something that I think's of interest, and they'll only accept it if they think's of interest. I'm not saying they're not critical reviews, there would be, but typically quite balanced in terms of here are things that are good, here are things that are less successful. I haven't much opportunity for the really scathing review, but I'd like more of them. And I have suggested sometimes, like I've suggested, say Mark Quinn's an artist I think is often not that good, but he's got a big reputation. I've suggested a couple of times I'd like to review one of his shows, because it'd be interesting to look at the difference between the reputation and maybe what I'm likely to think, without prejudging it. But that's been turned down whenever I've suggested him. And similar artists, I'd say, that magazines don't seem to want them reviewed.
How much do the galleries influence the magazines that represent these artists? Is there pressure from the galleries to the magazines not to?
I think there is. I think the magazines mostly have a rule that if the gallery suggests a show should be reviewed, then they definitely won't review it. But sometimes the gallery will pay for you to go to the gallery, and then you'll, on the grounds, if you pitch a review and the review's accepted, then they'll pay for you to go there if it's a foreign show. So there are various. I mean, another question I suppose is, what if you're reviewing an artist and you know them personally? Another question. There's all sorts of things that could, I suppose, affect what you write in various ways, and they're all kind of tricky issues which I tend to ignore on the grounds that I'm happy myself that I just write what I think.
I was just going to say, I guess the Evening Standard was a good example, because I think it never went below 3 stars, and so to me that was kind of like a euphemism. Like if a show got 3 stars, that meant maybe it's kind of dodgy, it was not that great. And then there's kind of artists like Mark Quinn, who it's kind of seen as acceptable to kind of give him a negative review, because maybe there's a bit of a consensus amongst the critics that he's, it's fair play to kind of dig into him for various reasons. It kind of works in interesting ways, I guess, compared to maybe more kind of universally kind of watched art forms like film, where it's kind of seems a bit more no holds barred. You just get a much wider range. But then I guess there's just a lot of differences between those two things.
Yeah, maybe it's because with films it's fairly obvious what needs to be reviewed, as it were. So what needs to get reviewed, the big releases all get reviewed, whereas there are so many art shows that maybe you can't review them all, so then you end up having more scope for this kind of filtering system, which does change the total landscape of what you hear about and what you don't.
There's a relationship between curation and criticism, no doubt, as well, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I do both, but I guess I think there are some critics who think it would be a problem if they curated as well. But then I suppose I just take the view that anything that's interesting I'll do. So I curate shows because I find it's interesting to do it, not for any other reason really. And I write about things because I think it's interesting to do it. So I'm not particularly worrying about whether the activities fit together or whether I'm causing myself a problem in terms of my objectivity. I mean, as Marguerite mentioned, I think I'm fairly objective, so and sort of cool in a way, rather than emotional. So maybe that helps in that you know, different personalities might have more problem with those sort of conflicts.
Down to integrity, I think. Because there's a lot in the past, people's integrity has been compromised. You know.
Yeah.
But that's why, because you are independent, really independent. That's how you have the freedom that you have. And again, you haven't been brainwashed. You don't
I have the advantage that I had a salary, now I've got a pension, so it's more difficult. Now I do have the thought that if you're actually trying to earn a living through certainly writing about art, but perhaps curating as well, it's really very difficult. The pay is minimal, really. So you typically get maybe 100 to 150 pounds for a review, and that's probably only kind of not much more than minimum wage payment, and it's quite hard to get lots of reviews. So if you want to make a living out of that would be difficult, I think.
Do we have any last questions?
What are you going to do with the framework next stage? Obviously, there's an ongoing conversation, and you said a more academic piece that you're going to produce. But will the framework be presented to a wider demographic, or to maybe internationally somehow?
Well, I think they're the two. I don't know about internationally, but the two things I thought might be interesting to do. One was to do more of the kind of academic background research, because it's not got a lot of that in it at the moment in terms of what's have been the previous approaches and how does this compare with them. And the other would be, yes, try and have a broader demographic involved in some way. I haven't really decided yet what to do. Perhaps it'll partly depend how long this lockdown type scenario continues. But I thought this discussion would be helpful, which is to kind of see which things might be interesting to take further. And I think going back to that previous conversation, I'll need to pitch to somewhere that would they like to publish an article about this. So yeah, I might suggest it.
I was just thinking about, when I said internationally, I was thinking, take somewhere like Hong Kong, where there's an art market that was on, well, it's still going and developing, and flowers have just opened up there, and it's because I go over there quite a bit. I see what's happening, but the conversations about art there and the attitude towards art is very different to what I see happening in London. It's a very, very different sort of market. The galleries, different setup, and so on, and the type of art that gets shown there. I just wondered if that framework was put to artists, to gallerists, and maybe, through somebody there, Joe Public as well, that you may get a different set of responses.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I did have some international
feedback.
Some responses were from Germany and America that were in my sample, of course quite a lot of artists in Britain are not. They haven't always been in Britain, so I think there's a bit of an international aspect. It would be interesting to extend that. Yeah, but that's three areas I could look at then.
Yeah, it's great, really enjoyable. I found it very interesting to do.
Me too.
It's good to talk to everyone and hear the comments. That's useful too.
But then, do you want to include some kind of like something beyond like paintings or sculptures? Like, I don't know, interactive stuff, or like something that it's probably more difficult to judge for people on pictures, but like something in that direction.
I think in principle the approach could apply to any kind of area of art activity. And I try to include a bit of performance through the Francis Elise piece. But I agree, It is another issue that some people raised was they were only seeing things second-hand, but I think ideally you need to have seen something similar firsthand in order to judge it fully. And most people would have seen, for example, one Damien Hirst spin painting, but maybe not that one. But it's an interesting case with Guernica that I think lots of people hadn't seen the original, but they'd obviously seen reproductions lots of times over the years. So,
but I think because with him they're so heavily conceptual that you probably might not. It kind of sounds a little bit rude, but in that case you don't necessarily need to see it, because I would assume it's a long duration or something you even wouldn't be able to see like in the whole length. But as long as you see the concept and the images, you understand what he's trying to do. So I think it's just a different type of work, rather. I don't think that it's like experiential something.
yeah.
Like in his case, I don't know.
No, it's true. There's some kind of work you wouldn't easily incorporate in the framework as I've got it here, but kind of a view that's based on actual experience, and then using that would still work, I think.
Would you think of writing a book?
Yeah, well, I think I did wonder, is there going to be enough material here to make it a book? So I suppose it would depend on how much I found adding the academic and the kind of research background led to, and if I got a broader demographic, how interesting that proved in the difference of the results. Yes, I've got in mind to be possible to do a book.
Do you think kind of this like push towards finding an objective framework might take away, maybe even the idea of the X factor to certain artworks, or it might take away some of the mystery, or it might kind of destroy certain parts of art making in a way? Or is that like a false fear?
Well, I think it would be if I worried about that, I'd be attributing far more influence to what I was doing than is.
But just in general.
So I'm not really worried about that. Well, it's interesting that the comparison might be with utilitarianism as a kind of moral philosophy, which is saying that you should measure, in principle, the happiness or the unhappiness of people to assess what's the right thing to do. And so that's been out there for a long time, but I don't think it's had that effect in that people still make their judgments on all sorts of different bases, and they know there's a possibility of quantifying it in theory through that approach, but I don't think that stops anyone thinking the way they do.
It's quite ironic though, because one of the definitions of what art is that it's not utilitarian.
That's true. Yeah, yeah, it's the things that are not useful functionally. Yeah.
I think it might be interesting to add in some aspects of like what value we get from art, like how do we quantify that, like rather than kind of all the focus being on how like successful or how good is a piece of art, like actually what is the end value of said artwork. Like I don't know if it's possible, but
does it improve people's life experiences? Yeah,
if it makes you think about things, I don't know, like certain things like socio-economic or political factors, or the environment, or I don't know, or like mental health, like how, like what's the? Because I don't think
you're going into the utilitarian again. If you're doing something to do something else, it's no longer a thing in of itself, so it's no longer art. I mean, Tolstoy gives a very good definition that an artist is someone who's having had an experience, can put it into lines so that when you see it, you get the same feeling that he had, even if the person's dead across space and time. So even though it may not be a popular definition, to me that kind of, and Tolstoy, he was a very good thinker, and he walked the talk because he made some amazing pieces of literature. And I always hold that in mind as a kind of totem as to justify what I do. That if someone gets something from the work, even if I don't understand the work myself, it's doing something quite mysterious to me. But I don't do it with that intention. I just do it, and then hope that I'm prodded to do something. And if I get the budding, that's enough. Because to motivate yourself to do anything is pretty difficult. When there's no financial reward, I mean, I have painted for commissions, but to do my own work, I don't do it with any idea of financial reward, because I feel that would compromise my intention a lot. When I sold something, I think, oh, what was that? What did that have? And if I've ever tried to try and pin it down, I've lost it, because the process that led to that work was maybe like making a great piece of music. It's mysterious, and then it's like the second album comes out, and somehow you're plagiarizing yourself, or it's mannerist. It doesn't have that authenticity, and other artists can see it. That's why the peer group review is so important. An artist, because we're in a very think positive society. And when I was younger, everyone was very like Matthew Collins. Everyone was, bitching about everybody else. Now I've had to grow up. And so you may have those thoughts, but you're not allowed, and it's not okay, it's not polite it's like talking behind someone's back. It's not okay. It spoils things. People have to bring their own associations, so better to say nothing. And then, you know who you like, you know which work's good, but let other people make their own minds up. I think what I've found in with reviews is mostly silence is the damning thing, ignoring bad stuff. It doesn't get
that's how it's dealt with, I think, largely, which is, I think, a bit problematic, because that you can't challenge silence in the same way as you can challenge something where you have to spell it out.
I got one review, and I did ask the person, why did you write that? My very first review. And they said, I didn't think you were adding anything to the debate. Like, I later found out she had very little background in art, but she had been in a powerful position to write about it just through circumstance. And her writing was very opinionated. But for a while, I kind of thinking, oh, what have I done wrong? And in fact, I did change what I was doing. So I was very unaware of the audience when I was doing that work. Just trying to get some work done. I mean, we're very delicate creatures. We don't like to be criticised. It's hard enough.
I think children are really good at giving very objective. Like, whenever I show my works, my nephews and nieces, they're very good at giving like criticism. Yeah. You can't get around. You can't fake it in front of them, and so they're always a really good benchmark, I think.
Yeah.
To take children to galleries and see how they respond to particular artworks, I think it's quite interesting. So. And they don't know their art history, and they don't know.
Brainwashed.
Yeah, so they just respond really directly and quite critically sometimes. But it's just really straight to the point. I think it's really great.
So that's another possible group I could look at then.
So. Yeah, no, I think it's really important. I think, I can always send the survey to my nephew and niece if you're interested. See what they have to say. Do we have any last questions?
That was great. Thanks.
Brilliant. We do this every time. If everyone can unmute their microphone and just give Paul a really big round of applause and say thank you very much. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you so much.